in technical spaces, I learned the foundation for inclusion from one of my best friends from college. We were at an event she was hosting, and at one point I sat back and watched her find ways to engage with everyone at that event. As a raging introvert, I was in awe. At the end of the night, I asked her, why did she put so much effort into engaging with every single person? To my introvert eyes, it seemed exhausting. And she said, I know what it's like to feel alone in a crowd of people. Loneliness is the worst feeling, and I don't want anyone to feel that way when I'm around. That really stuck with me, but it would be years before I could fully relate to that and do something about it. I've worked in tech for over 20 years, and while I've had some amazing experiences I could only have had in tech, many of those while working in the XR community, as a Black woman, it has also been at times isolating and spirit draining. And as long as I'm here, I don't want anyone else to ever feel like that. So, again, I'm approaching this conversation on empowering diverse communities in extended reality from two perspectives: my experience as an IRL community organizer and my experience building products for the XR community. And hopefully, we can meet in the middle and find some solutions. So, about 8 years ago, I started this journey of making room for people who are underrepresented, or as I like to think now, underestimated in tech, by creating organizations and events meant to empower and showcase marginalized people. And Arlen Hamilton, VC extraordinaire, created these T-shirts for underrepresented people with underrepresented striked out and replaced with underestimated. So I didn't come up with that. I want to give full credit. I started the Atlanta Network of Women Who Code in the summer of 2013. And I'd love to tell you this was an intentional part of my journey, but it wasn't. A friend of mine was going to start it and then found she would be moving to the Bay Area. She was trying to convince me to start it in her place, and I was doing my best to run from it. I had worked with nonprofits, user groups, and meetups before, and I knew how much work it would be. But I also didn't want Atlanta to be excluded from the very important progress we were making with women in tech simply because I wouldn't step up and organize Women Who Code here. So she brought down the big gun, Elena, the CEO of Women Who Code, and together they convinced me I wouldn't be completely terrible at it. I planned to start it and just not mess it up long enough for someone else to take it and run with it. But 8 years later, I'm still a director there. And something I started noticing soon after Women Who Code Atlanta started growing is that our presence in the Atlanta tech community started changing the conversations and experiences people were having. And now the Atlanta Network of Women Who Code is the most diverse and one of the most diverse and active networks globally. Our local leaders have worked really closely with larger Atlanta tech community leaders for the last 8 years to make sure our members, over 4,000 strong, have a seat at the table. We are making our mark on one of the fastest growing tech and startup ecosystems in the country. And so we extended that experience to a women in tech conference called We Rise. And this was really um, to showcase women in tech. We had done a speaker workshop series, and we were trying to give folks a way to exercise these new skills. And selfishly, it was also about kind of scaling myself as a speaker. I noticed that, conference organizers were becoming more aware of representation in their speaker lineups. And that means that they wanted to see, more women, they wanted to see more women of color, they wanted to see more Black women. And there were so few women of color speakers at the time that I was, one of those people that was, called on a lot. And while I really enjoy speaking, I knew there were so many other voices that we were missing in that conversation. And so I also wanted to bring some of those voices, into the larger kind of speaker network. And so, but I didn't want to just throw them in the deep end, right? Speaking at conferences can be daunting, especially if you're new to it. And so we held a series of workshops to make sure that people felt comfortable. And then we determined that the best way for them to exercise these new skills was, in front of family, right? In front of the larger Women Who Code Atlanta community. And so out of that, we created We Rise, which we hoped would be a really intersectional version of a Women in Tech conference. It was the first of its kind in Atlanta, and it was super successful. But we noticed that there was more to do, right? Um, a lot of times there are, you know, other intersections and other aspects of diversity that people don't even think about. They kind of just stop at women in tech. And we did not want to be kind of a shelter, occluding all of the other issues in tech. We wanted to tackle those too, and we wanted to be very upfront about that. And so we evolved We Rise into Refactor Tech. And so Refactor Tech really became the space of showcasing, people from different areas of marginalization, from intersections of marginalization, and showing the amazing stuff that they're doing in tech. And so it was this combination of really highly technical talks, but also addressing some of the inequities in tech relating to a lot of these folks and their experience. And talking about this from a social perspective as well. So it was this blend of tech and social, and we've done that for 2 years now. 2020 was a weird year, but we started Refactor Tech in 2019 and skipped 2020 and then did a virtual event in 2021, and we're returning for an in-person event next year. And so that's the kind of community organizer aspect of this. But professionally, a lot of my interest in XR and honestly in tech in general is exploring the intersection of some of these emerging technologies and social science. How does this affect how we're eventually going to interact with each other? It's really fascinating to me. And so that journey, my journey in kind of understanding how emerging technologies, especially mixed reality technologies, um, kind of intersect with our human interactions, kind of started very early. And I worked in academia doing graphics and XR and telepresence research at institutions like Clark Atlanta University, Caltech, and UNC at Chapel Hill. And then most recently, I worked as part of the mixed reality group at Mozilla. I led teams for Firefox Reality and for Hubs, and in that experience, um, building for the XR community, we were always thinking about things like privacy, safety. How can we make this a really rich experience, a really safe and rich experience for everyone that was entering? How could we make it as easily accessible for folks? A lot of that had to do with building for the web. And how did we use the web as this vehicle to bring mixed reality to the masses? And so, taking those two different experiences, I want to talk to a guide to creating and growing inclusive extended reality spaces. So the first step, and this might seem super simple and it may not seem like it needs stating, but I want to dig in here. The first thing you want to do is find and listen to your audience. This is a deceptively crucial point. Finding your audience means you individually may not represent the audience you're trying to include. If, for instance, you are a white, cis, heterosexual man or woman in tech, you may not be representative of the audience you need to listen to make space for more inclusive, make the space more inclusive for marginalized people in tech. I do a lot of work with career changers, bootcamp grads, and people who are new to tech. I've been in tech for over 20 years and came through what many would call a traditional path to tech. In the case of working with career changers and folks who are coming into tech through non-traditional paths, I'm not representative of the audience I'm seeking to include. So I have to listen well and have to include folks with that lived experience in the conversations. And then you have to actively listen to that audience, not just hear, not just make them feel heard, but take in and process what they are saying. I don't know how many times it's happened to me personally, or I've heard it happen to someone else from a marginalized background where they will share, a uniquely hurtful or discriminatory experience they've had, in real life or in a mixed reality experience, and they've had people say that you know immediately respond with, I've never seen that. Now let's dig into that a bit. Just because that person trusted you enough to share their lived experience, a piece of trauma in this case, with you, doesn't instantly make you the expert on their lived experience. So how does immediately asserting your lived experience help them? What you might have inadvertently helped them understand is that they can't trust you to respect their story. What you may have unintentionally done is invalidate their experience because it's not one shared by you or the larger group. And listening includes taking it all in: ideas, suggestions, feedback, and criticisms. And this is going to be crucial as we build, wide ranging communities for lots of different folks. We're going to have to hear it from their perspective. I follow Franklin Leonard on Twitter. And way back in 2020, he tweeted, "If you aren't ready for criticism from the community you make art about, maybe you're not ready to make art about that community." That really made me think on my experience as a community organizer and some recent events in my local community. And so I responded with, "This is also true of organizations and events. Taking and processing feedback is a prerequisite to allyship. If you can't take in and process feedback from a marginalized community and work with that community to come up with solutions that address their feedback, you are not an ally to that community." The second thing I would say is build for your audience. You want to center the people that you want to make space for. Don't make it about you or your sponsors or partners unless that's your audience. Focus on the people you want to include. And I have found that you can't go wrong if you optimize for the most marginalized among those communities. You may also want to make sure that you're building for intersectionality. You may have portions of your audience whose identities are at the intersections of various marginalized communities. There may be women who are also part of an ethnic minority. For example, my experience as a Black woman would likely be different than that of a white woman or a Black man. You might have someone who is non-binary but also has a disability, and their experience at the intersection of both non-binary and disabled is different than identifying as either non-binary or disabled. This is a big reason for some of the ways that we wanted to evolve We Rise, for instance, into Refactor Tech. And so when we're thinking about how individual members would experience our communities, you want to be thinking about how can we make our communities accessible to as many different people as possible. And so, thinking about kind of an in real life situation and then thinking about an extended reality situation. When we were first starting Women Who Code, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the landscape of Atlanta, but it's a sprawling city. It's very spread out. And so you can actually isolate a piece of your audience if you don't find the right location. And so we wanted to make sure that we picked a location that was easily accessible via public transportation, would not require paying for parking, and really removed obstacles that people might have in joining and interacting with our community. That same thought process is needed when you're thinking about your XR communities. So, what can we do to make sure that folks don't need the most expensive headset to enjoy the experience? Um, what can we do to make sure that cost, um, even internet connectivity, aren't things that are going to be blockers to those folks being able to access the richness of your community? Again, how can we remove obstacles to joining and participating in our communities? Um, Something that we worked on pretty heavily at while we were at Hubs, was to make sure that Hubs worked whether you were on, a amazing gaming laptop or gaming setup, or if you worked from a Chromebook. We wanted to make sure that we built something as performant as possible, not just because we were engineers and we wanted to build a really performant product, but because it mattered for folks who might not have access to the most expensive technologies. And then, you want to make sure that, everyone can experience the fullness, the full range of features and capabilities your communities have to offer. We were planning Refactor Tech the first year. We ran into a few accessibility hurdles. One of them was we wanted to find a place, a VIP or speaker dinner location. And there were several locations that were not accessible. And we had a speaker who was disabled and would not be able to use the stairs. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't make her feel as if she wasn't included in this experience as a speaker. And so we had to take that in consideration as we are preparing the environment for that event. You have to do the same kinds of things when you're preparing your environments in XR. How do people from various backgrounds and perspectives experience your environment and the community that you've created? So this is actually a party that we had in Hubs for one of our coworkers, and it was shortly after we launched our avatar editor. And there were more people at this party, and one of them, a Black woman in the EdTech VR space, mentioned that this was the most included that she had ever felt because she could make changes to, her hair type, her hair texture, her skin tone, her clothes. You can see me maybe in the back. I have the braids and the cat ears, and the glasses. And, I can speak from my perspective. I've never been able to, before that point, choose braids as an option for my avatar. And so even though I was part of the team that was building this, it affected me, and affected how immersive the experience was for me. So these are some samples from the open source Afro Hair Library by Dark. And he created it after determining that a lot of the the hairstyles that were available for textured hair were very stereotypical, and they were limited, and didn't really touch the full range of capabilities of textured hair. And so created this open source library that tons of folks have contributed to now that show the breadth and range of texture and styles for Black people, or folks with curly hair. And it's been amazing to see that because, again, um, in most video games and most, 3D experiences, um, I don't see a lot of people who have hair that looks like mine, who have skin tones that look like mine. And so this is something that really can take away from the immersion, right? The character or avatar that you're using doesn't represent you, do you really feel like you belong in that space? And so that's something that affects you in that experience, but also in real life. And so that's something that we need to think about. And representation is not just ethnicity, is not just uh, it's more than just that. Think about folks who might be disabled, folks who might use a wheelchair. If there are no characters or avatars or ways to customize avatars that look like them, that use the tools that they need to move through life, what are we saying about disabled folks in our communities? If we only have gendered avatars, for instance, what are we saying about people who do not express themselves with any particular gender? Are we saying that they don't also belong? And I've also seen where the non-gendering, for instance, of avatars gives people a little bit more freedom than they would have in real life. So thinking through representation and how folks in your communities experience that is hugely important to empowering the individual members in that community. So third, I'd say you want to build with impact in mind. You always want to consider the impact of your decisions and how they will impact um, and change how different people in your community experience your community. In listening and building for marginalized communities, I have found this to be true. Intent is more important than ego. You will mess up, even with the best of intentions. To give you an example, another one from Refactor Tech, our first year, we had kind of a machine learning, an AI-based transcription system because we wanted to make sure that we were including people who might have had any, hearing disabilities. But what we didn't realize is that you need a certain threshold of accuracy to really make that an inclusive experience for folks with hearing disabilities. And a lot of, at least then, and they may have improved some in the years since, but at that point, AI transcription services were not nearly as helpful as a live transcription service where you have a person actually doing the transcribing. And so our transcription service would say, something that was very different than what the speaker was actually saying. And so that's a situation where we created harm for those folks because they were excluded from the experience. They weren't hearing the same kinds of things or seeing the same kinds of things that the hearing audience could hear. And so you are going to make those kinds of mistakes. But if your good intentions are stronger than your ego, this will allow you to listen to your audience and apologize sincerely with a focus on the community instead of centering yourself, rather than the ill-fated kind of self-centered double down that we often see. And so we took that feedback from folks. We talked to a lot of folks in the hearing disabled community, and understood that we will need to get live transcription services. We'll need to advertise those. We worked really closely with a speaker who brought up the issue in finding the right vendor, and we had live transcription services for Refactor 2021 that worked really well, and we worked really well with that vendor. So if you're open to what your community is telling you, you can make that community work for them. And I would also say, far more important than intent is impact, right? We didn't intend to hurt anyone or to create any harm, but the impact was that we did, right? And you can only understand your impact by listening and working with that community. One last point on impact. If you cause harm, it doesn't matter that it wasn't your intention to cause harm. Again, your impact was harm. Telling someone about your good intentions doesn't remove that harm. You can only repair the harm you've caused by listening and then building with positive impact, not just positive intent. And then as we're thinking of building with impact, you want to make sure that you are protecting your community to empower your community. And so you want to think through privacy and security, especially. There have been cases where, certain, XR products sold the data from their users of that product. And, a lot of people, a lot of products sell people's data, and probably people don't think much about it. But in this particular case, an insurance company received some of that data. And for this particular user, there were certain patterns in the movement that they picked up from the data that spoke to a prediction of dementia in later years. And so, the user didn't notice immediately, but then, months down the road, they're trying to get insurance and they're getting turned down. They're a healthy young individual. They don't understand. And comes out that this insurance company has this information, and it wasn't just limited to the initial user. It spread to their family members who also were having trouble getting insurance. You want to make sure that you're addressing bad actors. It's kind of a known thing that women in the XR space and people of color in the XR space have, a different experience a lot of times than maybe some users. And so, what could we do to make sure that those folks feel included, feel like they belong? Um, and so, once we understand that there are bad actors in our system, a lot of times people are reluctant to remove or address or that behavior, but we have to, as community organizers, as leaders, as people who are stewards of the culture of our community, we have to take those into consideration, because those experiences make people feel like this is not for them. And I think that this is, these are technologies that are going to build the future. And so if we're telling people right now that this isn't for them, we're excluding them from something that is going to be commonplace in the future. And we will be, causing harm in measurable ways if we let that continue. So we have to, intentionally curate our communities in such a way that people feel safe, that they know that they can be new, to a community and still be respected, that they can show up in that community, differently possibly than others in that community, and still be respected and still be included. Four, you want to get aligned with your team. Um, you want to determine what is the goal, what are the missions of your community. And you want to, determine that together and make tough decisions with those goals and that mission in mind. I just wanted to give a shout out to my partners in crime for a lot of the communities that I build. Angel Banks and Beth Lang, they are amazing to work with, and really think through a lot of the issues of inclusion really thoughtfully and really intentionally. You want to make sure that you're being consistent, so that people understand what to expect of your communities. If you are going to address bad actors, make sure that you are addressing them consistently. Um, but not afraid to push the envelope. Finding, really customizable solutions for your community can help kind of push this in a direction where you can bring even more accessibility, even more representation to your community. So think through like the products that you are using, and the technologies that you're using, um, and seeing how you can push them to allow for even more inclusion. You want to empower new leaders, right? In your community. You don't want this to just be um, you as a leader speaking on this. You want to empower new leaders to help scale your collective efforts, but also bring representation to bear in the leadership. We have, you know, tons of members um, that have grown into leaders, for instance, in Women Who Code Atlanta, that bring such different experiences, and help us create better events for our community, because they have experiences that the three of us, me, Beth, and Angel, don't have. And so, making sure that your leadership, you're empowering your leadership, and that they are representative of your audience, um, also helps in building an inclusive community. Next, you want to scale intentionally. Whether you're working with your team, new leaders, or sponsors or partners, you want to be selective in who you expose to your audience. So those are, just a few of the ways I have found to make room for, you know, underrepresented and marginalized folks in tech and in XR communities. And anytime you're involved in an event, community, or an organization, these are things we can all do to make our spaces more inclusive. I feel like so many of us have been waiting for, maybe tech in general, maybe the XR community, to become this really inclusive place that changes the world for the better. But we are the people we've been waiting for. It won't happen by accident. We have to intentionally do the work to make these spaces inclusive. Thank you.
Erica, thank you for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Let's see, we have just a few minutes before we got to get going for our next talk, but we do have time for a couple questions. Does anybody have questions? You can use the hand raise emoji.
Yes, I see someone has their hand raised.
Yeah, Nisha, please, if you can walk a little closer to the stage. Actually, hold on, give me 1 second. I will I will amplify your voice. Can you let's see. There it is.
Yep,
Okay, go ahead. We should all be able to hear you now, Nisha.
well, thank you so much for your talk. That was really inspirational and exciting to see that, folks like yourself are working in the space towards means of inclusion. And so I guess my question for you is, since you've been in the space for a while, are you seeing a trend towards more inclusion, especially with, VR, AR, immersive technologies? I feel like there's an opportunity because it is an emerging field to not
Mhm.
repeat the mistakes of past industries. So I'm just curious from your perspective what you're seeing along those lines.
Yes, so really good point. And I agree that VR and AR and most emerging technologies have this opportunity right at the beginning, right before it becomes mainstream, to, to your point, not repeat the mistakes of the past, to learn from those. And so I think we need to your point, take full. I am seeing a lot of folks thinking really, intentionally, really thoughtfully about how we create these spaces. There's some amazing folks out there. I know there's some good talks, and I'll share my slides. I'll share a link to my slides, and it'll have sources and kind of additional reading. But there's some great presentations. There's April Spate at Microsoft, who's thinking really thoughtfully about these kinds of things. Um, there's Liv, who is working at Amazon on an open 3D engine, and was also an amazing member of the Hubs team. And she's thinking in a really thoughtful way. She has a great presentation that I'll also include in the links in the additional reading. There are a lot of folks that are part of XRSI that are thinking about this in really interesting ways and pushing the industry because of that, right? So I think that there are people out there who are thinking about this. I just recently read an article about how there were um, people who were kind of playing the role of people of color in AR VR space, and how, what are the negative ramifications of that, and the fact that people are exposing that and learning from that, I think will also impact the industry. So people are thinking about it, people are moving in the right direction, but we need more, right? And we also need more representation, so that again you can bring people with those varied experiences to bear in the leadership and the decision making.
Thank you for that answer. I couldn't agree more, and I just really appreciate the work that you're doing and others in the space are doing towards those means. So thanks for sharing all those resources as well. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you for attending.
I remember seeing that article you're speaking about they were doing like diversity training, but hiring white
Exactly.
actors to play black characters, which is just kind of embarrassing. Yeah, definitely still a lot of work to be done. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And you mentioned April, and I just want to say we have a full day of wonderful talks. And actually, April is hosting quite a large panel at, I believe, 11
Awesome.
a.m. Pacific Standard. It's going to be just a really phenomenal panel. So I really encourage everyone to keep coming back. And up next, in I think 19 minutes to be real precise, we have the E-Safety Commissioner of Australia, Julie. I'm forgetting Julie's last name, forgive me, but that talk starts here in just about 18 minutes. But any final questions? Does anyone else have a question? Okay, well, in that case, this room does stay open. So, if you have time, totally up to you, Erica, you can step off the stage and actually interact with people, and they can maybe just have a conversation with you instead of a on-stage question. And yeah, other than that, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our live audience on YouTube. And yeah, thanks for being here.